If you're ready to take your destiny into your own hands, you've come to the right place. This is The Bulletproof Entrepreneur, featuring interviews with the most exciting and amazing entrepreneurs. Here's your host, Chi Odogu.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into the show today. If you love what you hear on today's episode of the podcast, go to iTunes and leave a review and a comment. It helps other great listeners like yourself find the show. And of course, you can always find more episodes of the Bulletproof Entrepreneur podcast at www.odogwu.com. And without further ado, on with the show.
Hey everyone, welcome to the show. I have a great guest on the line today. I'm talking to Sal Fazzolari. Sal is the founder and CEO of Sal Fazzolari Advisors LLC. Prior to starting his consulting company, he was the chairman, president, and CEO of Harsco Corporation. Harsco Corporation is a multi-billion-dollar company that provides industrial services and engineered products primarily to the steel, construction, railways, and energy industries worldwide. The company employs 19,000 people in 350 sites in 53 countries. Sal has held numerous senior management positions and has a broad-based professional experience in management, advisory, board service, private equity, public speaking. His career spans over 4 decades. He's currently a board member of several companies. A few of the companies Sal sits on the boards of include RPM International Inc., Orange Hook Inc., Garnet Fleming Affiliates Inc., Bowman Hat Company, and he also serves as an advisory board member to a few private equity firms, including Current Capital LLC, as well as AEA Investors LP. He's the author of the CEO Lifeline series of books, the first of which is 9 Commitments Every CEO or Every Leader Must Make, which was published in 2014. And his second book was just released 2 weeks ago, which is Exceptional Habits of Elite Companies. So I'm pleased to have Sal on the show today to tell us a little bit about himself, his business experience, and his background. Sal, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chi, and thank you for those very kind words. I'm honored and obviously very happy to be on your program today. I'm very excited to speak about my new book, which is really 4 decades plus in the making. Actually, probably a lot longer if I start with my career back as a kid.
Yeah.
Probably just like you, I started working when I was very young. I actually had my first job at age 8, and from there on, I haven't stopped working since. So I have many, many, many decades of work experience, and this book is really the culmination of all those experiences and knowledge that I gained.
Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to become the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation.
I'd be happy to do that. Well, I lived the dream. Gee, I really did. Embodiment of what's called, living the American dream.
Yeah.
I'm an Italian immigrant. I came to the United States when I was 9 years old. And, it's like all immigrants, very, very poor, literally with the shirt on our back, and that was it. Worked very hard. And I was very fortunate to obtain a job in the internal audit group when I started at Harsco. And I worked my way from a staff auditor all the way up to chairman, CEO, and president of the company. I've held just about every job you could think of in the company. During that goal, I was the head of the internal audit group. I was the corporate controller, chief accounting officer. I was the treasurer. I was the CFO for 10 years. I was the president of the company as well. And then I became the CEO and chairman. Ultimately. So it was a long journey. It was an incredible journey, obviously, as you can appreciate, particularly given my background. And so I was very lucky, to have the right people take an interest in me and help promote me.
Now, when you talk about lucky and having the right people take an interest in you, what do you mean by that? Because I know as an immigrant, sometimes you might feel, I'm not good enough, or I don't have the skills, or I don't have the background. But you came, you worked, you saw the system, you saw what you wanted, you went for it, you stuck with it. There were many challenges along the way, which we'll talk about. But tell us a little bit more about that luck that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in luck, and I talk about it in both books. so were two of my favorite business writers, particularly Jim Collins, who's by far my favorite. He talks extensively about luck, and I am a true believer of it. I've studied that quite a bit. And what I mean by luck is, being at the right place at the right time. Mm-hmm. There's events, having the right person recognize you and decide to back you. I did have that person who I actually ultimately was his successor, and he was in senior management at the time when I was in internal audit. And he took a liking to me. I was very lucky that he did. And he and I worked together for, 25 years. And he brought me all the way up. And there was one other person as well. So between the two of them, they brought me up along the way. And so, obviously I worked hard. But as you well know, a lot of people work hard, right? But you don't get the right opportunities. So I was lucky that they took an interest in me, and I was at the right place when those positions became available. That's purely random. That's, as you know, there's so many, and I've interviewed so many CEOs, and I've spoken to so many CEOs, and the good ones that are humble will tell you that, similar to what I said, that they were lucky. And what they mean by that is during their career, they came across a lot of talented individuals. Yeah. But those individuals never had an opportunity to really show that skill for a lot of reasons. Mm. So that's kind of what I mean by that.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. I totally agree. Sometimes it's just opportunity, meeting, preparation, and then you find yourself at the intersection of both, and then things start to work out for you better than other people that either have more skill, more talent, more connections. So yeah, luck is a major factor on the road to success in life. What were some of the main challenges you faced leading such a large organization?
Well, the biggest, actually, I was confronting several challenges at the same time. I didn't know it quite exactly at the moment I took over. I had to, here's the luck thing again, right? Yeah. I was unfortunate from a luck standpoint to take over as CEO on January 1, 2008. Wow. Technically, I actually took over August of 2007 when I became CEO-elect. And so anyway, let's say the fourth quarter of 2007, when the Great Recession began, obviously. Mm-hmm. So I took over literally as the Great Recession began. As you all know, the Great Recession clobbered just about everyone, right? But some companies were punished much more severely than others. We were one of those. And the reason we were punished much more severely, because we were in two of the most cyclical end markets you can pick, steel and construction. Wow. And those two markets just got hammered. We, just to show you the impact, the company revenues peaked one year at $4 billion. The following year, it dropped to $3 billion. Over a course of 12 months, because of the Great Recession, we lost $1 billion in revenues. No company can survive, very well that kind of hit when you see your revenues drop. So I was confronted with, massive cost cuts to, survive that significant downturn. And we did. We cut $230 million of costs. We did all kind of other things. We also, consolidated, but did not stop the investment side. We invested particularly in China and India, which today now I believe is bringing a lot of value to the company as a result of that. But, so not only, we weren't just cutting, we were also selectively investing, which is very difficult to do. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we were trying to transform the company to make it, more global, more innovative, more customer-centric, and those kind of things. So it was a very difficult thing to do. But we navigated through this, I think, relatively well through, end of 2007, 2008, and 2009. What happened then is we got into 10 and beyond, we got hit with another major crisis, which in my view, for us, because of our footprint, we had 53% of our revenues were based in Europe. Well, back then in 2010, early 2011, as you may recall, that was the European sovereign debt crisis. Europe spiraled literally down as fast as you can imagine during that time period. similar reasons that, a lot of the U.S. companies spiraled out of control during the Great Recession of '07, '08.
Yeah.
And so no sooner were we coming out of one major economic, crisis or turbulence, major turbulence. In fact, it was the worst in 80 years, right? The U.S. crisis. And then we got hit with the sovereign debt crisis, which actually, believe it or not, had more adverse effect on us because 53% of our business was based in Europe. So it was a very, very difficult time for the company. But we, again, managed to, I think, get through it, relatively okay compared with many, many other companies that were enduring, such hardships and so forth. But a lot of lessons learned, right? I mean, a lot of the lessons in my 2 books come out of those experiences and so forth. So, and I obviously I'm a much better manager, much better advisor as a result of having those experiences. Because as I'm sure you've read over the years that you talk to any thought leaders in business, they will tell you, including some greats that go back, even thousands of years, some of the great thinkers of the Greek philosophers and so forth, they will all point to one thing, that really experience is indispensable, right? There's nothing like experience. There's no substitute like an experience. You cannot really gain tremendous perspective on things without living it.
Yeah.
And believe me, I lived it, I can assure you.
You mentioned something about innovation. That got me thinking that innovation and disruption are the 2 biggest things that are affecting, I would say, even 100% of the companies around the globe right now. Most companies seem to talk about innovation a lot, but when you look at it closer, they're not, taking any risk. They're not doing anything to actually be innovative to stay ahead of the curve. Now, is that because of a lack of time, money, or do they lack the commitment or the will to actually implement innovative strategies and drive in order to change the way they're doing business?
It's a great question, Chi, and I think it's all the above, in all honesty. And I may add one other thing. Maybe you need the board to be very engaged in innovation. And I think for whatever reason, companies think they're innovative. Some view innovation through a very narrow lens. And then a lot of companies just get complacent because they think they're because of arrogance and other things, past success, and they just kind of believe in certain things that are really not true. Mm-hmm. And so that what happens over time, cumulatively, these have a dramatic effect on the company, and they lose sight of what's going on in the place. And then, lo and behold, next thing you know, they're in deep trouble. So let me just start. I'm a big believer of innovation, right? Through all my clients that I consult with, as well as particularly private equity, because most of my focus the last 6 years has been on private equity, which has been tremendous experience because I have the highest respect for private equity. No one can run companies better than private equity, other than maybe, the true elite companies like Apple and Google and so forth. But other than the true elite companies, no one runs companies better than private equity. These guys are just fanatical, about operational excellence, strategy, and so forth. And we can get into that a little more. But getting back to innovation, the thing with innovation that I think a lot of leaders don't think clearly about is this. You need to view innovation as very holistically. So to me, and I'll give you an example, to me, innovation is really everything you do in the company. So it's from the way you close your books in the finance side, to the way you process customer orders, to obviously how you deliver your service or your product, how you improve your products or create new products, how you even internally communicate and so forth. So innovation really needs to touch everything in the organization. And this is where a lot of companies don't understand. They think it's just simply, new products, new services, that kind of stuff, which obviously is very important, but it's only one piece. And I'll give you the best example that I've ever come across to me, which is timeless and really captures the essence of it, is of course, Steve Jobs, right?
Yeah.
The poster child for innovation. But if you read Steve Jobs' book, what does he talk about? He says in the book that his most important innovation was really the way he organized Apple. Now think about that. Here's the best technology company on the planet, and that he created, the greatest, in my opinion, the greatest CEO of all time. But yet he talks about, and he was so proud of the fact the way he organized Apple was one of his greatest innovations. That just says it all, right?
Yeah.
This guy could see that, hey, it's not just the products. It's just how the whole company is organized, how it runs, how it functions, and so forth.
What I can use to summarize that is not the what, is the how. You can have two people running the same exact company. The way one person will structure the operation is different from the other person, and that's what drives success.
You better believe it. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Let's dive into your first book now. What were some of the lessons that drove you to write that first book?
Oh, the first book really was a lot of lessons learned, right? That was really the essence behind that book. And so, but people don't want to just hear about lessons learned. And the more I started writing about that's how I started the book. And the more I thought about it, I said, well, I need to take us to another level. So I came up with these 9 commitments.
Okay.
And which is a framework, is a management framework. I said, what are really the 2 most important parts of the organization? Put the board aside, which I talked about the board in my third book, but on my second book, I mean. So I said, what are the 2 most important elements? Obviously, it's the leaders, and then, of course, the enterprise itself. So I said, there's really 3 I call them lifelines, because metaphorically speaking, everyone needs lifelines, right? And you can't survive without them. You need them in mountaineering. I use mountaineering as my metaphor, but to get the point across. So you have 3 personal lifelines and 6 enterprise lifelines is what I came up with.
Yeah. So what are
So within that...
No, go on.
I'm sorry, go... No. So within that, you have the... So the 3 personal lifelines I came up with were really one, and the most broadest, is really your characteristics as a leader. So I identified 30 specific characteristics that I studied and observed over my, 40 years of business, right? What did I admire in people? What character, for example, intuition, instinct type things, ethics, perseverance, those are kind of characteristics. So I identified 30 characteristics that I think are really vital for a leader to possess. Some of those characteristics are innate, and others, need to be developed. And but the combination of those things what really defines a leader, and ultimately really make the path forward for them to be successful or not and reach that summit. The second lifeline, individual lifeline, is what I call indispensable experiences in the book. Well, indispensable experiences is what I mentioned earlier, right? The indispensable experiences, really, you are a culmination of all your experiences. Yeah. What's important is to have the right experiences. So that's a tricky thing. So I had a guy I used to work with, I'll never forget, it was a great statement he used to make. Someone would come to him and say, hey, I've just found this individual has 30 years of experience. And so he would look at the resume. He'd say, no, he doesn't have 30 years experience. He has 1 year experience 30 times.
Yeah.
And so think about that. So that's what I mean by indispensable experiences. You really need to have the right mix of experiences. Like in my case, I'll use myself as an example. So, I was a corporate controller. I was a CFO. I was a president, which ran the operations. All these types of jobs I had. I was an auditor.5 So I lived out in the operations for 15 years, in the audit field. So all those indispensable experiences really formed that foundation for me to ultimately become CEO. I could have never become CEO had I not had those, particularly the C-suite experience, so CFO as well as president and running the company. And so indispensable experience is very important. So when you're developing a talent management program for your future leaders, you need to make sure that they get the right indispensable experiences. And that's that lifeline. The third one is proactive actions. That's kind of a characteristic as well, but I left it out as a separate lifeline because I believe it's that important. I believe that you need to be very proactive as a leader. Yeah. So not just as a characteristic, but also as a lifeline. If you're not constantly proactive, you don't take the game to where it needs to go. If you're reactive, you're just gonna get, the game's gonna end on you because ultimately everything will catch up to you. So you need to have this proactive mindset, which I viewed as a third lifeline. Then I have 6 enterprise lifelines, which are just as vital and just as important. And those 6 lifelines, just real quickly, if you want, I can run through them.
Yeah, let's run through them.
I could talk an hour just on one of these lifelines, right? I mean, that's how vital they are. But business model, right? If you don't have the right business model, and what I mean by the business model is I have 2 parts to the business model. One, we already talked about, the way you organize the company. The second part of the business line is your unique capabilities as an organization that Michael Porter talks a lot about. So that's lifeline 1. 2 is what I call learning entity. You need to have an organization that has the ability to learn. And that needs to be instilled, and mechanisms and culture of the company need to make sure that the company learns from mistakes as well as success. All these. This need to be really good at executing, right?
Yeah.
Where the business model is really a strategy. Exceptional capabilities is really execution. The 4th one is what I call people excellence. Well, people excellence is really obviously your people. You need to have the A team, everything around talent management, and development of your people and your leadership team, from your global leadership team to your key seats to your executive suite to your board to everyone else in between. It's all about the excellence in people and how you go about developing these great leaders. The 5th lifeline is really distinctive culture. Again, if you study a lot of great companies and a lot of great leaders, they always talk about culture. If you don't have a healthy, vibrant culture in the organization, you'll never be an elite company. Mm-hmm. And culture is driven by a lot. Like I said, we could talk about each of these forever, but I'll keep going. The final one is what I call core philosophy. Your core philosophy is really your core purpose or your mission. A lot of people call it mission. I call it core purpose or purpose. Your purpose is your why do you exist as an organization, which is actually probably the most fundamental, most important, right? Because if you don't know what your core purpose is, you really don't know what you're even doing as an organization. And then as a subset of that is your core values, which kind of fall in line with your core purpose. Yeah. And the core purpose one is interesting to me because I've studied a lot of companies and I'm amazed, and I talk about this in my new book quite a bit, particularly in the Q&A section, where how many people don't understand what a core purpose is. I think there's a book out there called Why or Why or something, which kind of talks about the core purpose. And Collins talks about it extensively. Michael Porter, many others, talk about it extensively. But if you go on and look at websites, I'm just always amazed how lack of clarity on the company's core purpose, other than the tech sector. Yeah. If you go out and look at the tech sector, they get it perfectly. I mean, my favorite core purpose of all time is Disney, actually.
Yes, I love Disney.
Disney's core purpose. Okay, you know that one, to make people happy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. It's so simple, but wow, is that powerful?
Yeah, and it cuts across every single thing they do, all their business lines, theme parks, movie theaters, films, TV shows, everything is centered towards making people happy, and they integrate that so well. I think they do it. I think almost on par with Amazon, but those are the 2 main companies that do things very well, especially when it comes to living out their core purpose.
Yeah, and Google, when they first started, I think their core purpose was excellent as well. I think it was something like to organize world's information and make it universally accessible, something like that. But then the reason they changed their name to Alphabet because they started moving away from their core purpose, and so they didn't want to deviate obviously from their core purpose. So they let Google stay as Google. Then their other businesses have their own core purposes, which makes a lot of sense, right? So, but anyway, I think I've said enough about those.
Yeah. No, that's good. Now, I want to draw one thing here before we now move on to the second book, and that is, you mentioned culture, as one of the 6 corporate lifelines. So, given everything that's going on in the marketplace, especially in the news, everything we've heard from Uber to United and all the other companies, why is it that a lot of CEOs seem to just pay lip service to culture and they don't take it as seriously as you would expect? Is it a policy problem or what?
It's interesting. I think it sort of goes back to what I said about some of the other lifelines, or when we were talking about innovation. I just think they don't understand. Some of them either don't understand what culture really is, or because they just have so many other things going on that they don't implement the right mechanisms. See, I'm a real big believer in mechanisms, right? So, like, for example, to make my point here, if you can say, yeah, I want to create a great culture, but if you don't build and implement mechanisms to ensure that happens, you're not going to get anywhere. And the best example of this, let's say integrity. Let's talk about integrity for a second. So you can say, yeah, we're an ethical company, we really believe in, but that's all. You just talk it, but you don't walk it. So, for example, a mechanism for integrity would be your code of ethical business practices, right? You codify what the practices are. You train people on the code of conduct. If people violate that code of conduct, they're immediately dismissed or, actions taken. That's what I mean by mechanisms. You got to build all these mechanisms in the organization to ensure that you live it. So where culture, it's even more complicated because culture is all-encompassing, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a whole different ballgame there. And I just think they have not, particularly say a company like Uber, because they're flying at 180 miles an hour, and there's no doubt in my mind they never even took the time to think about building, the right mechanisms to ensure they create, a very healthy culture there.
Exceptional habits of elite companies, and I think when you were talking about, working with private equity firms and doing things at an elite level, I want to throw this first question to you, which is why is it that private equity companies do things so differently in terms of driving performance at their portfolio companies to operate at a higher level compared to companies that are not operating at the elite level?
Well, it goes back. I think it's part of it is a cultural thing, but you got to remember, okay, it's a totally different business model, right? Say from particularly a public company, you couldn't get two more dramatically different business models. So if you look at the private equity model, first of all, they're living on a very short cycle, right? Private equity guys, they turn companies. That's what they do because they get a lot of money from pension funds. That money has to be returned at some point. So they have a singular focus. They're going to buy a company, and they're going to take it from good to great, or they're going to make it, they're going to greatly improve it or make an elite company if they can. And so what they focus on is a couple things. One is strategy. Two is execution, right?
Yeah.
And three, leadership. The three things I talk about extensively in my new book. But what they do with that, though, is they build the right mechanism. So, like, for example, compensation. They align the interests of the managers, the owners, as well as the board of the private equity firm, all are very heavily invested. So if you look at a public company, for example, a lot of boards are not really heavily invested in the company, in all honesty. They all have shares, right?
Yeah.
But nowhere near the level that the boards have in private equity groups, number one. So the level of investment is dramatically different there. Two, same thing as ownership. And, there's always exceptions, obviously. I'm just talking generalities.
Mm-hmm.
The management team usually is a heck of a lot more, heavily invested in a private equity firm than they are in a public company. So you got that aspect as well. And the third thing is they don't have all the distractions that the public companies run by private equity. The public companies, they got shareholders, they got analysts, they have, quarterly reports, they got all these analyst days. They got the SEC, they have all these things. It's from a time standpoint, value, whatever. I mean, it's clearly not creating any value, most of that stuff. So the inordinate amount of time that CEOs particularly have to put in for all those things, managing the board even. I mean, it just goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
That's why most CEOs work 80 hours a week, because they can't, it's two jobs they're doing basically.
Yeah.
They're doing one to deal with all the things I talked about. The other one, they're trying to see customers and trying to run the company.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what are some of the lessons in your new book, The Exceptional Habits of Elite Companies?
Sure. What I tried to do with this book is I tried to write something that I think would really help, particularly newly appointed CEOs, or you don't have to be a CEO, obviously. It could be a new leader or something. People that are thrown in a situation that maybe were not as well prepared, by the company for various reasons as maybe perhaps they should have been, or just simply there wasn't enough time, and also because the world has changed so much and there's just, it's gotten so complex and so forth and so on. So what I try to do is map out a framework here that I think could be very indispensable to particularly newly appointed leaders,
Mm-hmm.
as well as, say, for example, executives that go back for an executive MBA program, right? So this would be an ideal book for those kind of sessions. So that was the primary objective, and it's really that framework that I think would help. And it's made up of, the what I call the foundational pillars, which is, the strategy, the execution, and so forth, and then the 9 lifelines, and then the 102 habits, specific habits that I think, which are made up of, enterprise habits, leadership habits, as well as board habits. That's how I bifurcate or segment the book into those 3 things. And so within each one of those, I talk about all these vital habits that I think you really need to possess in order to achieve, excellence or achieve elite status as an organization. Without all these, so if this is kind of similar to, what I mentioned with the private equity model. Mm-hmm. It's kind of the same thing. If you don't have the leadership of the company, which I consider mainly the top 100, obviously includes everyone, but the top 100 being the most important. So you have the leadership, the top 100, the board, and the enterprise itself through its, mechanisms and processes and so forth and so on, and practices. If you don't have those three things working like a finely tuned orchestra, you cannot achieve elite status. Mm. And so that's what I was trying to point out here. So in each of the habits, build on each other.
Yeah.
And that's in essence what the book is all about.
Mm. Share some stories from your experience that led you to develop some of these habits.
Absolutely. Great question. Let's see. Maybe let me just start. I'll start with the leadership ones first and then just kind of go through it that way. How's that?
That's fine.
One of the most important that I talk about, and it's sort of a characteristic as well, that I talked about in my first book. And that's what I say it's habit number 3 in the book. And it's go with your instinct. It will never fail you. I can tell you, G, if there's one thing that sticks out of my mind over my 40-plus year career, professional career, that is really like seared in my brain, is the not going with my instinct. And I paid the price if I reflect on my career, all the times that I did not go with my instinct, it always came back to haunt me. When I did go with my instinct, it always worked out.
Yeah.
So I try to stress in this that you really need to rely on your instinct. Now, what I said, though, is that, everyone has different abilities there, right? A guy like Steve Jobs probably had the greatest instinct on earth, right? The guy was just incredible instinct. We're not Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
But we're never going to be Steve Jobs. But everyone still has a certain amount of instinct. And what I point out in my book, what's very important, that took me a lot of years, a lot of decades to figure out, is that you can actually greatly enhance your instinct by doing two things and focusing on two things. One is being disciplined, okay, in everything you do.
Discipline.
And second, developing critical thinking capabilities. Okay, so if you're a very good critical thinker, it can actually help you tremendously in making better instinctual, decisions and so forth. And so that's what I kind of emphasize, in my book. The military, by the way, which I've got to know over the years through various participation things that I did, they teach, critical thinking quite extensively. And now I get it why they do that, because it's really important. So I would recommend to your listeners that if there's any takeaway from this podcast, is that really rely on your instincts, but make sure that you're very disciplined in everything you do, and make sure that you develop over time critical thinking capabilities, so you can rely more consistently and help you rely on your instincts. And it'll help you a lot in your career.
Yeah. And what are some ways to develop these critical thinking capabilities?
Well, one way is it to, really truly understand, right, what, those critical thinking capabilities, how do you do that? Well, part of it is, is training your mind on how to think better. That is, make sure that you have facts, for example. That's a critical part of that, right? What happens is, as human beings, we have this thing called cognitive bias that you need to stay away, or attribution and so forth. So part of the critical thinking thing is that you better make sure that you truly understand and review and live by unimpeachable facts. And then also processing that and understanding that and thinking through that before you make decisions and before you rely on your instinct. So just don't go by your gut only, say, without really thinking about it, right? So you come across a situation where your instinct's telling you, I got to do this. But then what discipline and critical thinking does say, okay, you got to be disciplined. Discipline says, well, I want to think about this. How am I going to think about it? Well, I need to get all the facts. I need to understand this. I need to bring to bear all my skills, all my experiences, my perspective that I've developed over the years, use my other precocious characteristics that I've developed, and so forth. And then you make a judgment based on that process. Well, that's what critical thinking is all about. So you get better outcomes. By getting better outcomes, you will reinforce and strengthen your instinct, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And as we start to wind down the interview, because I know you and I could sit down and talk about these management principles, and I want to ask you a few wrapping up questions.
Sure.
A lot of people right now are concerned about what the future holds in terms of their career long term, and you managed to build a long and successful career in the business world, especially up to the highest levels, playing as a board member now in several successful companies. So how can young people still early in their career start setting themselves up for success for the long term?
That's a great question. I do get that asked in various ways by a lot of young people. I try to mentor young people, and I try to speak at universities, as much as I can. And it's really, believe it or not, it's quite simple. One is proactive. What I told you earlier. You need to have your entire career a very proactive mindset, and it's very vital that you do that. Number two is you need to also be in what I call is the personal continuous state of improvement. Right? You're always trying to. It's sort of like the elite athletes. You look at the elite athletes. No matter how great they are, they're always out there practicing.
Yeah.
Training, exactly. They're building. They never stop. They're always trying to improve. No matter how great they are, they're always trying to improve. That's you. So you never stop developing, learning. And as you know, especially nowadays, it's a lot easier to do it than when I came up my career because you have podcasts, you have TED Talks, you have online courses, you have so many things, right?
Yeah.
But so never stop learning. Also, get into the company's management development programs if you can, and volunteer for those indispensable experiences. Volunteer for an overseas job in Europe or Asia. Volunteer for whatever. Always be proactive in pursuing things. So I think if you follow those basic practices, I think will get you a long, long way. Then there's other things, obviously, you need to work on. You need to have the highest ethics.
Yeah.
You need to be a team player. Collaboration is very important.
Yeah.
You need to learn to treat people, with respect. Make sure that you always, live your life with, tremendous humility and discipline. I think all those things together will really take you a long, long way in advancing your career. It's really difficult. Actually, young people, that I believe today, they're in an environment that is a lot more difficult than I faced because you're really competing against the globe now. You're not competing just within the United States and so forth.
Yeah. The opposite side of that, looking back on your career, I know you've mentioned a lot about, luck, being at the right place at the right time, but if you could share something else, maybe that you've not shared before, which is a secret key to your success that you've not mentioned on this podcast or anywhere else. Is there anything else like that you have?
Yeah, I think yes, and I'll tell you what it is. It's really, again, great question. It's having unwavering faith in your abilities and your beliefs, and that no matter how dark it is out there for you, we all come across dark periods in our lives, right?
Yeah.
You're never going to be 100% successful. You're going to have failures. The important thing is to learn from those failures, and the important thing is to have unwavering faith in yourself and your abilities. So, and always being I never stop. Perseverance. Infectious enthusiasm, always Every job I ever tackled, people used to say to me, "My God, you're so enthusiastic. You're so, always there. Never, I never missed a day of work.
Yeah.
I was always at work. I worked, just never ending. But it's having that, unwavering confidence in your abilities, I think will go a long, long way, because everything's not going to go perfect on your climb to the summit.
Yeah, that's true. And with that said, my friend, we've reached the end of the show. But before I let you go, Sal, where can people find you, get to know more about you and your business, as well as where can they find your books, especially the new book that just came out 2 weeks ago?
Yes, very simply, just go to my website, www.colifelines.com. And obviously, the books are available, particularly the new books, available on Amazon. Just, hit CO Lifelines and it'll come up. And so that's two best ways to get in touch with me. But clearly through my website, you can communicate with me as well.
Okay. And I'll make a link of that on the website once this interview is published. So, Sal, I really want to thank you for coming to spend the last 1 hour sharing your words of wisdom, sharing your advice, as well as talking about your experiences, which you documented so extensively in your 2 books. And I wish you continued success as you continue your journey now as an entrepreneur running your own consulting practice to high-level CEOs across the globe.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you. I'm very honored and very humbled by this, for you to allow me to share my story, and I'm most appreciative, and I really enjoyed this, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into the show today. If you love what you hear on today's episode of the podcast, go to iTunes and leave a review and a comment. It helps other great listeners like yourself find the show. And of course, you can always find more episodes of the Bulletproof Entrepreneur Podcast at www.odogwu.com.